all the stuff that goes with that: leftism, resistance, hegemony. So today we have a guest. He's a YouTuber. Do you identify as a Zoomer out of curiosity?
When does Zoomer start?
Somewhere late mid 90s.
Well, I
Or
guess
whenever it is that you start using the term mogging.
no.
He
I would
doesn't
say, I
identify
would
Yeah,
yet.
say
that's
I'm a
that's your answer.
late millennial.
I feel like
Okay.
also Zoomers are defined by
But
choosing to identify as something.
they do know all of the mental illnesses, ones that we didn't even have.
Yeah, whereas we are just
We are just. Do you remember when you had to sit and wait for your parents to reload the film into the camera?
I vaguely do
us.
actually.
Yeah. Anyway, not a Zoomer. Got his master's degree recently. Political theory, content creator. One Dime. How's it going, man?
Pretty good. Good to be on this pod with the goat. Yeah,
Who's
like
that, Victor?
No, the goat and
Pills.
his minions.
yeah, like I know you like to play the humble guy, but like I will say that I genuinely believe you're the only YouTuber who makes better videos than me. And I say that as like a cocky thing because I do take pride also in like visuals and trying to make it substantive while being very visually engaging. And there's not a lot of examples you can really find on the internet of balancing accessibility, content, and artistry. It's pretty hard. There's some people I like who do it in a different way. There's the whole theater kids, the bread two people. They're really good at that. I think that's a talent. It's not a talent I have. But yeah, no, I respect that. So yeah, it's cool to be on this pod.
Great. Good to have you.
I-
So we watched your video. I mean, also, thanks for gassing me up. That's why we invited you.
Oh,
No.
Pills is too modest.
Pills hates that. He hates that.
Well, it's a matter of taste and defining the quality of a video based on how long it took you in After Effects. I mean, that's something I do. It's not something that the algorithm does, of course. That's one way to do it. And I definitely appreciate videos that I need to pause and rewatch sections for some real clean, good animations. But I can tell you that that's not the algorithm's priority, unfortunately for us. But One Dime spent some time on his, evidently. And yeah, we're talking about one of his videos in particular today. It's about controlled opposition. And in terms of audience and all the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of media, YouTube videos, they're made to be quick paced, they're made to be fast and loose. You got to keep that viewer retention really high if you want any views. But here we try to do something a little bit more thorough here. So we wanted to we're not debating, we're discussing. But the topic of the video that we're looking at, One Dime's video, controlled, or is it contained opposition? Contained opposition?
Titled control opposition because it'll get more search value that way. People will find it. Though that hasn't worked out. Weirdly, sometimes the videos I'm most proud of end up getting less views than the ones I made in 2 weeks.
And did this one not get as many views as you were expecting?
No, yeah, it really underperformed. I was really surprised compared to other videos. I didn't think my video on modern monetary theory would pop off, and that's my most viewed video that has like 360,000 views now.
Mm.
And I
You know what
didn't
that
think-
tells you? It's like people searching for monetary policy and are looking for an explainer who are in some undergraduate class. They come across your video. I wonder if that could be part of the boost.
Are they teaching MMT in undergrad?
I don't know. It's just like, but it is one of those things where it's like, okay, what do people even mean by like? I could imagine someone maybe just because I'm the kind of person who like a thought will pop into my head and I'll be like, okay, what that thing, that fundamental feature of our society, I don't understand it. I'm going to Google that, and I feel like if a video comes up with that, I might be more inclined to see it.
I mean, that could be a good way into audiences. Is like, why is that? Why does that happen? Videos you don't expect to do well, and the ones you're more proud of tend not to. I mean, it seems like it could be a lack of just like buzzwords, like you said, control. Okay, yeah, control. Let's watch this. But I guess MMT happens to be like hot right now in a bunch of like podcast and YouTube circles. So
Yeah,
maybe
you never
just
know.
having that was a coincidence rather than having those kinds of words. Just a coincidence that people happen to be interested in this right now.
Yeah. Also, being first to market matters when the term's not already saturated. Like, niche is a highly searched term, but there's so many, many bad videos on niche. And if you try to add to that at this point,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to work. But anyway, we have contained opposition, a theory.
Yeah.
I would call it conspiracy style,
It is.
the video editing style. And then we want to talk about, to what degree is this a conspiracy? And I think I'm going to probably back myself off of this for a while because Victor is also an expert in this, currently writing his dissertation on democracy and all that.
Pills, I know you said you didn't want too much biographical stuff, but I have to ask before I kind of dive into the questions. I want to know a little bit about Tony's background in terms of what got you into like political theory. I know you said you just did a master's in political theory, and you mentioned that actually in your video. And it's funny because when I was watching the video, you talk about how you got a degree where most of the people who get the degree end up working in,
That's actually my bachelor's. I was referring to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What was that in?
So I actually really liked my master's degree. I was really lucky to be with some of the best professors I've ever met, some really good mentors. I felt like there's people there who actually were interested in reading it and were there because they liked it. Because, no one does a poli-sci master's because you want to get a job. Is not exactly
Usually
the most
not, yeah.
It's not the most employable thing. It's like, studying philosophy. It's like your prospects is just you like philosophy or you want to go into law.
Mhm.
But it was my bachelor's degree which was actually called the Public Affairs and Policy Management.
I know about all the Papham kids. I know about them. Yeah. I know their reputation.
Yeah, well, as you know all too well, that is, I would say, the prime type of program geared towards pumping out like the archetypical professional managerial class individuals, people who are primed to be bureaucrats, and the ideology that dominates that sort of program is very status quo-y, and it's you might have a sort of progressive side and a conservative side, but it's generally around within the centrist Overton window.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mentioned in that video that people who were in this program would generally be going to NGOs if they were on the left. That's what I saw a lot of people doing, and they would get into this sort of faux activism. And I mean, that sounds a bit harsh because I know a lot of people have good intentions when they go into these things, but there's all sort of funnels for people to just kind of feel like they're doing something and exhaust their energies. And yeah, they end up just frankly just having their emotional labor exploited for money and internships.
Totally.
Yeah. And then you have people who just are literally in the bureaucracy.
Totally. And, those kinds of programs too, when you hear like paranoid conservatives saying, the university is dominated by, the woke or Marxist elite or something. And I don't know, maybe it's different now, but my memory of Papham was there was actually a lot of conservatives there. A lot of people ended up going to work for the Conservative Party of Canada and stuff. That was like one of their main pipelines. But
can you tell me what is Papham?
Public Affairs and Policy Management. It was just the way that it's just like the way
the Papham kids.
The Papham kids, yeah.
Are these the type that wear like suits to class?
Yeah, there are people like that. There are people
like
wearing
that.
suits to class. There's people who would go do mock parliament, and
oh yeah,
that experience made me, because I found those people very annoying. So there's a small subsect of people within the program who are more like artistically minded, and it was about 4 or 5 of us, and these were like my friends in university at the time, and I don't know, I became kind of depoliticized almost due to the program. Just I would do my readings, and I found especially the early years of political theory interesting, but then it got increasingly more administrative. I was literally taught classes like political communication, which was teaching you how to do propaganda. Literally, it was very about administration, the administration of politics, as opposed to politics itself. Like, what are the ideas? That was only for a short time in the early years. So I got into philosophy and a lot of stuff that I wasn't taught in that program on my own, completely on my own, just for the fun of it, like Marxist theory. I got into critical theory, got into a bunch of stuff that I wasn't really being taught in that program. So I guess that's sort of
just from electives and stuff, or
no, I just bought the books.
Oh, okay.
Just interest.
All right. Well, then that's settled. He's not a Zoomer.
Yeah. Well,
Especially during COVID. Yeah, during COVID, it really accelerated the amount I read. It's actually, I remember during that time, I came across Pills's videos because I was trying to understand what the hell, it was Guy Debord, Guy Debord, he was
Oh
on
yeah,
about one of your really
Society of
early videos.
Spectacle.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you the question about what you said. I think you already answered the question I was going to ask, but you're saying programs like PAPM kind of prepare people either for a life in what, like the NGO industry, bureaucracies, or like the corporate private sector.
Or
And you
political
refer to
parties.
this, yeah. And the way you put it was you referred to it as like this the socio-political matrix that I guess absorbs graduate students. And I was going to ask you how you escaped from that matrix, but I guess you already sort of answered my question there. You got into philosophy, started reading on your own, and then you studied it from a more theoretical perspective later in grad school.
The sort of thing, what I mean by escaping the matrix, I don't so much mean like, oh, this makes you have a politics or let alone a revolutionary politics, but rather just not falling into that cycle, which is, oh, I feel there's something wrong with the world. I'm going to try to do something that's better than nothing. And people get sucked in. They get in this habit where you are radical while you're young, and then you become a sort of conservative or liberal when you're older. It's such a common pattern I've seen. And it's quite interesting just due to the fact that it's not in the interests of people who are older and who pay taxes and who have to work full time. You'd think that it would be more in their interest to be critical of wage labor and to be more critical of capitalism, to want a better society. But you tend to see people get conservative as they're older. That's a trope. I'm not sure empirically how true that really is. But you see it for sure. And that's, I think it's kind of part of that is because people get sucked into sort of pseudo activity. And that includes radical parties. So some people think, it's not just peaceful protests. Peaceful protest is useless, but I'm going to go join a Maoist org and, throw Molotov cocktails at small businesses. It's like, that's just as useless.
Yeah.
Nice. So we are pretty much already at the topic of the video, which is contained opposition, a theory. And I think it's pretty bold to say, I'm going to present a new theory, my own theory as original work, especially on YouTube, because the majority of the feedback is either great video, man, fire emoji, or your hair looks stupid and I don't like you. But that's what we wanted to ask you about. So your theory, and I also want to ask you about why it's yours, how it's yours, all that kind of stuff. And I'd like you to explain that if you can. But your theory is contained opposition, which has a lot to do with this feeling of being exhausted. And kind of like you've already been saying, your energy is channeled into things that are useless as opposed to things that are useful. I'd also like to know what you mean by, what's pseudo politics versus real politics, what's real action versus non-real action. But to start all that off, could you package up contained opposition, the one dime theory for us?
Wait, but first, just real quick, did he say exhaustion in the video? I don't remember that coming up. Maybe I missed. You did? Okay, I missed that.
That's actually a reference to
Beyond
Schulman Society.
No, actually, no? But that would be a good comparison. But there's a lot of references to other people's theories who I was responding to. So in my dissertation, which ended up getting quite well received, and there's a bunch of things I wanted to add to it, and to make it to a book, which is going to come out in Revol Press. And it's mainly on building on the theories of Sheldon Wolin. Basically, Sheldon Wolin has this theory of managed democracy, and it's a framework of understanding democracy that I think obviously is very critical of liberal democracy and liberal ideas of democracy, liberal rhetoric of it, but also of Marxist theories that try to just, write it off as bourgeois democracy. Wolin accepts the anti-capitalist critiques in Marxist texts of the limitations of constitutional democracy, how capitalism undermines democracy, class conflict, etc. But the idea of bourgeois democracy doesn't actually tell us very much about the differences between different constitutional democracies and what is possible within them. So there's a lot of things that ended up responding to in discussion with my supervisors, which one of those things was resistance. So for in an undemocratic society, how can we have resistance? How can you have a totalizing system? Because Sheldon Wolin has this theory of inverted totalitarianism, if you have resistance. And one quote that somebody said in a discussion was they invoked Foucault's quote from The History of Sexuality, where there is power, there is resistance. And the sort of idea here is you can't actually have a totalizing power, in that there is resistance inevitably, and there's all sort of resistance, just not in one center. There's not one big power, and there's not one big revolution. There's all these disparate resistances. And I kind of thought, I mean, this sounds awfully compatible with the current system, because we've had that. We've had nothing but disparate resistances since, you could go much further back, but I think really the 90s is when you start seeing a lot of constant disparate resistances. There's in the video, you might notice I invoke Hartin Negri's Multitude, because in the 90s, they write this book called Empire, in which they kind of think the old Marxist class conflict is over, and that the new revolutionary force will be this popular multitude of disparate resistances. Now, I kind of thought, well, how do you square the fact that the system seems to be really going in a dramatically undemocratic direction? And when Sheldon Wolin published his book, Managed Democracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism, it was around the re-election of George W. Bush.
I hope you didn't come here to knock Hartin Negri, because revolutionary multiplicity, we're big fans here.
That's a joke, by the way.
You sure, man? I think they solved it. I think we're good now.
Yeah, no, I know you're not like that other podcast, but that we won't name.
We won't name them.
What? I'm just saying, if you turn off the lights and say revolutionary to yourself a whole bunch of times in the dark, then you're going to get the world you want.
Yeah, so I always found this idea interesting, controlled opposition. A lot of people talk about it in a sort of conspiratorial way, but we know that, and some people today will give examples of the CIA Congress of Cultural Freedom, having funded various magazines in which left-wing thinkers have written for, to back a sort of compatible left. But I think most of us who study politics seriously know that there isn't just a big cabal controlling the opposition, and that this isn't a very lousy theory. This would be a very lousy theory to explain why the left is as impotent as it is. But this sort of challenged me to think about a lot of things: the nature of power in regimes, as well as the nature of resistance of politics. A big thing was, well, why do we seem to think that resistance is an exception to the rule of hegemony? That's almost like a presupposition in left thinking. We tend to think, oh, there's resistance, at least it's not Nazism. We're not at fascism yet. You always hear the rhetoric, the totalitarianism, the dystopia, whatever, is coming, with whether it be Trump, whether it be so-and-so boogeyman. And there's less of an examine. They think that just because you have the right to protest now, that, okay, like forget the system now, it could be worse. It could be like Orwell's 1984. But I mean, it really should be considered that the right to resistance is not some sort of exception to hegemony. It's actually this expression of a stronger hegemony. If a system is able to tolerate resistance, it's much more powerful. I mean, if a system feels the need that any protest is an existential threat to its regime, like how East Germany felt about its protests, or how the Soviet Union felt about the protests in Hungary, for example. I mean, that's a sign of a very unstable, weak regime. And if you're able to tolerate resistance, it's good not just due to the fact that you have sort of a legitimacy, a democratic legitimacy, that you see people have a right to resist. But also, if you allow resistance to exhaust itself to a certain degree, it actually undermines long-term the ability to change the system. Because you really see revolutions in history occur when a boiling point reaches, when all attempts to reform the system, when attempts to change it peacefully have all been exhausted or just been shut down violently. I don't really need to go down to the list of examples here, but that's part of it. Now, of course, it's risky to allow opposition. It could manifest into something dangerous. And that's why I say there's a twofold character to the system. There is this totalitarian aspect to it, which is, I hint at, I talk about COINTELPRO, surveillance, and how when it was examples of serious resistance, the state does resort to classically totalitarian maneuvers to obliterate it. But it seems to be very lenient with all sort of other protests. And I think we get in a bit of a cycle of contained opposition. And I say that because if you allow resistance to occur, you don't have to control it. You just have to make sure, when the kids are playing outside, that they don't go out of your reach, basically. It's and you'll notice I invoke a lot of psychological metaphors there, a lot of parental metaphors. I've always found views of ways of viewing the state sort of like an extension of the family very interesting. You see this in, of course, Freudian Marxists' views of the state, as well as even Hegel's philosophy of right kind of sees the state in this way to some extent. The real way is to actually allow people a limited degree to resist it, and it's not just an illusion. It's not just a conspiracy for the system to fool people, but it's actually just good for the system. Sometimes a system needs to adapt to its resistance in order to actually improve itself. Because when you don't have a degree of liberty and expression, whether that be political or economic, you actually don't really understand what your population really believes. If you try to enforce rules too hard, you get a sort of complicity that you don't ever know is genuine. You have people say, "Oh, I support the regime," but they secretly, are very opposed to it. A good example is the movie "The Lives of Others" about the DDR. Really illustrates this phenomenon well. How if you get overly paranoid about your subjects, they end up just lying, and you get a sort of confusion as to what's going on with the populace. So if you allow economic liberalism, which China does, you have now consumer research, marketing research. If you allow political liberalism, you have what? Public opinion research. You have voter demographics. You have all these ways of studying the population. That's good, not just for controlling the population and using rhetoric to win votes, but also just actually adapting the system in ways that change a few things so that everything else stays the same. However, right, if you embrace the ideals of liberal democracy genuinely, and you really allow for different parties to participate, and you allow for all kind of different parties to mobilize, of course you have the risk of the system destabilizing. France is a chronic example of this. France always has protests. It's been much harder for the French government to impose neoliberalism and austerity without protesters trying to blow up cars every week. There is a real risk of parliamentary democracy from the standpoint of the dominant classes of society. So that's why some often, the wealthy sometimes opt for a dictatorship. They would like a Pinochet because it restores order, it destroys the threat. But what I kind of argue is that with an inverted totalitarian regime, which America's, I think, the best example, but there's other examples like Japan, like some others, which I don't discuss in the video, but I discuss in the book a little bit. It has the best of both worlds in this regard. It allows for a good mix of hard power and soft power that allows enough liberty for people to feel that they can change the system and to engage in activity and, get that out of their system, so to speak, as well as to give the system legitimacy so people follow its authority, regardless of how bad the economic downturn is. And also a degree of hard power with the national security apparatuses, that is, what people today call the quote unquote deep state. It's been studied academically by people like Peter Dale Scott. They call it deep politics, just institutions that are kind of completely undemocratically accountable, that engage in terroristic forms of suppression of violence. FBI's COINTELPRO mission is an example of this, or CIA sabotaging of democracy internationally. We don't need to go over that again.
Okay, that's a lot.
That's
interesting.
That's a good summary. That's a very good summary.
Yeah, it's a big package. Maybe could I just do, in advance of getting real heady with this, an example that came to my mind that many of us remember. Well, no, we remember part 2, But part one was before we were born. The punk rock scene had a bunch of albums and tours, Britain and the United States, basically saying F Reagan, F Thatcher, and it was called Rock Against Reagan. And then fast forward, this was brought back in the Bush years by the new punk scene, protesting in particular the invasion of Iraq. And they put out a few albums and did tours as well. It was F Bush, called Rock Against Bush. And I like this example because what is a mosh pit but a supremely useless expenditure of energy? And here it becomes, just by veneer or simulation, an expenditure of political energy. And all the big name punk bands are on there. NoFX, Offspring, Green Day, Anti-Flag, Pennywise, etc. And I think it exactly shows what you are saying in this respect, that it's just give people that disagree something to do. They're going to wear their t-shirts, they're going to buy their band merch, they're going to maybe kick in some windows, but as long as it's just kicking in windows, then that's okay. And then the whole thing goes away and we continue operating as usual. But it's like, don't be a hard parent. Be a parent, have the rules in place.
Permissive parents.
Yeah, there you go. You let them act out a little bit, but then at the end of the day, they're always going to come back home for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, there's that like space of sort of cultural freedom of expression where you can sort of have edgy punk rock music. I mean, this even reminds me of Adam Curtis. I think we did an episode on this a while back. On his latest documentary. Is it still his latest one? Or whatever. Can't Get You Out of My Head. He even mentions Tupac Shakur in this context too, saying, American culture especially opens up these spaces of expression where you can, protest or critique capitalism and those sorts of things. But it's false. It's kind of an illusion. The space itself is just where these kinds of energies emerge, burn themselves out, and then kind of disappear. And that it did remind me a bit of the idea of contained opposition, because I think correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the idea that there are these sort of gaps in the system of power, but they're planned to be there. They look like places where you could enter into and sort of leverage some kind of revolutionary or protesting power there, but really they're supposed to be there. There's spaces where, like a permissive parent, you can allow your children to act out and complain about shit. And then, but really what it does is it they're shaping the landscape underneath that activity and guiding it towards this sort of burnout. So like what you said earlier, then later on down the road, you just kind of become disillusioned, you give up, you become like a centrist or conservative. And this is actually, it's not a unplanned thing. It's a feature of the hegemony of how liberal democratic capitalist systems work.
Yeah. So currently we're kind of looking at this low fidelity rendering and maybe risk sending to 20-year-old by saying, it's the system. This is how the system works. So to avoid that, I wanted to kick it to Victor and ask, what's your political theory angle on this political theory?
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions, but I kind of want to zoom out a little bit because, the account you offered just now, your really good summary of the argument you make in the video, and I think kind of how you lay out the argument in the video itself. It's kind of like, you're engaged in a kind of theorization, or it seems like it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that I think is sort of descriptive, right? It's sort of like describing an account of how the system works. And it feels like there's maybe an implicit normative theorization, but it doesn't feel like it's stated outright. And I think this is something that I find in like Foucault, right? Like he's describing the system in a way that sounds nefarious, but like he doesn't come out and say like, this is bad. He just kind of like is talking about it. And it kind of seems like, and many, I would say, critical theorists kind of engage in this kind of theorization. And it seems like you're doing that. But I kind of just want to come right out and ask you, like, what do you see? Like, do you have a view on the moral status of something being a system, right? So, like, is something being a system necessarily a bad thing? If it is, then like, what's bad about it? And then that also raises a whole bunch of questions of like what it would mean to live in a world like without a system, right? Which could, I don't know if that means true democracy. I mean, there's a lot of questions there. Maybe we can talk about democracy afterwards, and we can just take them piece by piece. But I'm kind of curious how you see the kind of theorization you're doing, and whether there's normative questions fit in to that, or are you kind of agnostic or neutral about that question?
I'm going to, before you answer, I'm going to intervene on behalf of the audience because, Victor, we know that you like this word normative.
It's all it means is something good or bad? If you think something is morally good or bad, that's all. It's a value judgment. That's all it means.
Yeah, and when you say value judgment, do you mean as a moral principle, as if you're judging the system from the outside, or do you mean it in a practical sense of normatively, it's easier to carry on just by doing what's expected in this case?
Well, in this context, how I'm thinking about it is there's a lot of talk about systems and the way that it controls opposition, right? But it's not like, at least as far as I could tell, that like Tony comes right out and is like, that's bad, right? For this and this and this reason. It's just describing it. He's like, here's how it works. And by the way, I will say, like, quite persuasively, I mean, I think a lot of the things that you're saying, I agree with them. But to me, like, I guess the more, I don't know if it's more important question, but like the question of like the so what question, I think requires a kind of answer to the question, well, is this bad, right? Because if it's not, then who cares, right? But if it is, then maybe we should do something about it. Maybe we can't do anything about it. So I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So within that question, there's sort of two questions, it seems. One is the fact value distinction, which I wouldn't say I fully believe is possible to maintain in any analysis fully. But I think you're right to characterize my analysis that way, as it is with a lot of critical theorists, and that it is an attempted descriptive analysis. Obviously, I have an implicit value judgment of it, but there's aspects I try to be as descriptive as possible. In a good example of that is when I mentioned the Soviet Union and East Germany, because I have a point where I say, perhaps if the East German government didn't psychotically foreclose all dissent, you wouldn't have had the sudden fall of the Berlin Wall. And my point there is, aside from the psychoanalytic references there, which is that it's just really I'm trying to understand how governance works. Because if you're from the standpoint of a socialist, I'll give it a good example. I found myself arguing with so-called tankies often with and because I don't deny the overt realities of the super authoritarian nature of a lot of those regimes. However, I don't take a sort of anti-communist position, and they would often say, well, no, it was for the good of society and they needed to do it, etc. And I'm trying to say, no, they didn't. Even from a pragmatic point of view, I'm not interested in morally denouncing communist regimes just because I hate communism. But from pragmatic governance, I think part of the descriptive theory I'm trying to lay out is that of pragmatic governance. It's trying to understand how the system works, but also subtle sort of notes for, even socialists, because I think a big thing that went wrong in actually existing socialism was that there was an inability to reform the system. There was it was just a very rigid system. And when they tried to suddenly reform it way too fast, like in Gorbachev, it just totally collapsed. It wasn't prepared for that. It absolutely wasn't. So it's, I guess it's hard to separate facts from values. When Marx is, of course, objectively analyzing Capital, he has the normative analysis that exploitation is bad, even though it's an objective thing, right?
Yeah. Hold on. I just wanted to make sure, because we don't lose the central point here, because I want to sharpen the edge of a disagreement, if there is one, and ask Victor, is that kind of what you meant going this fact value route?
Well, I would just say that I think I'm just more interested in hearing what Tony thinks about the system as he describes it, as being kind of contained opposition, whether he thinks that's a bad thing. Just kind of like to simplify it.
Well, I think I have a way to put this that brings it down to earth too, because the way you frame that video is you talk about the 2003 protests of the Iraq War, and you say, these are some of the biggest protests in history throughout the US and UK, and yet they had like zero effect on government policy decision making throughout the war. So, and you mentioned some others too. You could think of like, the Black Lives Matter protests or Occupy Wall Street or the climate protests, whatever. They all seem to have very little impact on like actual government policy. And then so the question is why? And a potential answer to that question is, well, we can understand this phenomenon through the idea of contained opposition, that these protests and movements are planned for. Whether or not contained opposition is like a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I think it's like Machiavelli, right? Writing The Prince, right? This is how you govern. You have to be good when it's good to be good. You can be bad when you have to be bad, but the prince has to be able to do these things, to be the fox and the lion when it suits their needs. And so, that's like throwing morality aside, just being like morality is just kind of like a clothing you can put on when it suits you.
So one thing that was difficult for me to square with this analysis was the fact that I'm not actually a radical Democrat. And this is because when I was studying Sheldon Wolin and his theories, one thing I found myself at odds with him is the fact that he is a radical Democrat. And I just couldn't find myself believing in his vision of democracy, which didn't seem very clear, which was a sort of more local, directly participatory democracy. And, I could be wrong on that. I do think, there's a lot of forms of democratization, which I do believe in, which are actually more on the economic side, especially in terms of economic democracy. And I think there's ways we could heavily improve representative democracy, but I'm not quite there when it comes to direct democracy. I'm actually very skeptical of that. In fact,
so it sounds like you're kind of trying to develop a more pragmatic account. Again, you used the word pragmatism earlier as well. So
yeah, because I had this other professor who's a teacher of radical democratic theory, who is much more on the sort of you could call it far left in terms of democracy, at least libertarian left. And he believed that democracy was a good in itself.
Yeah.
And I actually thought about that for a long time. And I thought, actually, I don't even know if I agree with that. Because I mean, yes, because what if you democratically, elect a fascist, or you democratically decide to kick all the immigrants out, or you democratically decide all sort of different things. And I found in the Cultural Revolution is a big lesson with regard to that is if you let unrestrained mass rebellion and allow for a so-called democratic people's courts, which a lot of people don't want to admit, that's what struggle sessions in the Cultural Revolution whereas people deciding the fate of other individuals, often by a sort of disorganized vote within groups. I'm quite skeptical of that. I think there is some truth to the tyranny of the mob, but so I'm not a radical Democrat, and I don't think there's a sort of we can return to ancient Athenian democracy. However,
okay. So there's good, there's bad, and then there's worse. But just feet to the fire, contained opposition, good or bad?
Yes, but I think the big question for me, and this is where I do become a bit of a old school Marxist in just this regard, is for whom? For me, that's what matters. Is like for whom? Who is a system being governed for? Who is being represented in this representative democracy? Because I do believe in representative democracy. I think it's much more practical than direct democracy, and I think you can democratize aspects of life, but I'm not sure about voting on all sort of different things directly. I could be wrong, because I know, Victor, you read a lot about sortition, so I'm curious to learn more about that.
No, I mean, I think it sounds like it sounds like we might be somewhat aligned, because I think I share a lot of that kind of skepticism. I think my dissertation is kind of a critique of radical democracy, which includes, although it's funny, Wolin is someone I skipped for some reason, but I have like Laclau, William Connolly, Bonnie Honig, and a bunch of other people, and also Hart Negri, and so it sounds like we might be somewhat aligned. So it kind of sounds like what you're saying, so maybe the way to read your argument is more like, look at the way this particular kind of contained opposition is preventing the representation of certain kinds of voices, right? Maybe namely in this case, working class voices or other kinds of interests. And the system kind of does a good job of letting those people become occupied with other things. But so it's not so much, but you're not saying that because your alternative is some radical democracy. It's just something a little bit more pragmatic. Because I guess the other question I was going to ask, and I don't know, maybe it's too long a road to go down it, but I guess like the ontological status of that contained opposition, because I think some of the conversations we've had on this podcast a lot are sort of about, in some ways, like some form of that is maybe unavoidable in the sense that it's some kind of spontaneous reaction that ends up building some kind of system that becomes calcified in some way. And it's not like you can't really ever have something that's free of a system. Because sometimes I think another thing that, maybe like less educated readers of people like Foucault and a lot of the theorists that you engage with, I think they kind of make the mistake that, oh, there can be such a thing as like no power, or there can be such a thing as right. And it's like, no, like power is spontaneous. It's, it's productive of the social world. You can't really get rid of it. And I think maybe similarly, some kind of containment or some kind of, maybe you see these things as separate. So
to be fair, Foucault, I don't think thinks power is you can live without power. I think he's more of a Nietzsche.
Totally. I'm saying that people who read him,
but
I'm saying that people who read him don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do find it very interesting, the fact that you have people who are Foucauldians, Deleuzians, Harton-Negrians. They tend to gravitate to sort of anarcho-liberal, or I'll say libertarian left politics.
Yep.
And they do really believe they view power with hostility. Not all of them, but it definitely does show in their politics because they're very skeptical of any sort of centralization.
Yeah, any hierarchy. Yeah. Yeah,
and you do see this tendency with the left in general, which is to fetishize these, even with someone like Badiou, especially with someone like Badiou, actually, to fetishize big spontaneous revolts, to fetishize the revolution, and to not think about what comes after in the order. And for me, that's what I'm very interested in, is how to governmentality. One person who caught on actually to what I was really doing with that video was someone said, "Oh, so you're looking for a socialist governmentality?" I'm like, yeah, actually, because I'm not trying to understand governmentality in general. Of course, this is the Foucauldian term, but at a practical level, it's how do you just govern society and their subjects? And I think socialists have to think about that too, because if you don't, you risk it just falling apart. It not because I'm a socialist. That's my normative stance. Like I would say, I'm not very partisan. I'm not very sectarian, but I'm a socialist, and I generally gravitate to a Marxist conception of communism, which is one that isn't based on equality, but one based on freedom and one based on needs. And teach according to the need, teach according to the ability. I'm not anti-hierarchy, but I do think class holds back human evolution. This will be something that's actually in another video of mine in the future called "What is Socialism for? The Darwinian Origins of Marxism."
Sounds spicy. I wanted to jump to a different thing here. I think it's connected still. The U.S. Constitution serves a ruling class. I guess this was maybe the first time I heard about that. I always had an inkling, I guess, but you kind of say the founding fathers' goal with writing this Constitution was to, enfranchise the property owners, the ruling class, and to keep the populace powerless, the general population of propertyless people.
Yeah, it's not unique to that's not a unique argument though. Like that's as old as someone like Charles Beard made that argument.
Yeah. He in 1913 he wrote the economic interpretation of the Constitution. Right.
Yeah. Well, I also found it very interesting, and that John Locke and Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, highly inspired by John Locke, both Jefferson and Locke literally believe in the right of revolution against a despotic government. And I always thought this was fascinating because they were, slave owners and massively wealthy property owners who presumably did not want to lose that privilege. So when they're talking about revolution, what are they talking about? Because, you look at it, it's such a great impetus. Why don't Marxists take this up and use that aspect of liberalism and flip it on its head? But one also should think that unlike Hobbesian, someone who believes in a strong, which I really think a lot of, Marxist Leninists are Hobbesians in the way they think. They believe in, the strong state that the proletarian state has to suppress opposition. But what if you actually, for legitimacy, to legitimize power, you allow for resistance and allow for that potential right of revolution against the despotic government in theory, because then you have a much more meaningful basis for consent of the governed. And if you don't have a meaningful and what is perceived to be a legitimate basis for power, and democracy is, of course, legitimized through popular sovereignty, consent. Well, what is legitimacy based on exactly? And it's really performance. And I talk about this in Phantom Democracy, the video called Phantom Democracy.
Mhm.
And in that video, I talk about how you tend to see the collapse of one-party states whenever there's an economic collapse, or whenever they don't fulfill their stated function, whenever they don't perform, in other words. Because if people don't believe that their consent is given to them voluntarily, given to the ruling order through a vote, why would they allow you in power? It's as long as, they can grill, as long as they can chill. It's whatever, that's what they care about. But when shit hits the fan, and there's no basis for for the government's rule, you'll have a resistance. So that's the point there is socialist regimes previously were legitimized on the basis that they were the dictatorship of the proletariat and that they would fulfill the transition to communism. And eventually this just got watered down to improving living standards. After a certain point, socialism meant like if you're doing better, that's what it is. And when that stopped happening, when you start having the decade of stagnation, and that really bleeds in for a while, and the crisis intensifies with Gorbachev's reforms, which made it worse, not better. You have, you have a power vacuum in which, Boris Yeltsin is elected as president of the RSFSR, who then they kind of have a coup d'etat against the USSR. Point being there is it's the question of, I view democracy from this sort of realist standpoint of legitimacy. And the case, I think, for lessons for someone who espouses a different prescriptive politics, which let's say that's socialism, you want to govern around that. We have to understand these things and not just think that, because we support the right ideas that we will be able to govern a society. No, you either have to govern through performance or through consent of the governed. Now, what if your regime can't perform due to things you can't control?
Yeah.
You need, I think popular sovereignty is a thing that isn't considered, and it's not considered by like Marxian theories of dictatorship of the proletariat very rigorously enough. And I say that as someone who's greatly sympathetic to Marxists, and I would even, I would call myself a Leninist in a certain degree.
Well, I know Victor brings up legitimacy a lot.
Yeah, well, so I mean, that's interesting. So kind of circling back a little bit to what we were talking about before, because it kind of just reading between well, maybe it's not so much reading between lines, but like it kind of sounds like what you're saying is like we need to learn from this controlled opposition, and kind of like use it. So it's not so much, we need to get rid of controlled opposition. It's just that we need to use it so that it can be a socialist version of which maybe you're alluding to when you say, look at the, maybe the Soviet Union, not that you would have wanted the Soviet Union necessarily. So I don't want to put those words in your mouth, but like if they had allowed for more kind of built-in forms of dissent, maybe they would have been a more robust form of governmentality that could have been, better at surviving, and not as liable to collapse. So I don't know, am I wrong that your view is really just you want to build a kind of socialist system, or at least implicitly, where we learn from controlled opposition and use it?
I think there's a lot of truth in that characterization. The caveat is I do think there needs to be more democracy in all sort of aspects of life. So there is an idealistic element to my politics, but I try to keep that a bit separate from the analysis in the video, because yes, I do think I do believe in establishing a sort of socialist society. But what always gets me is whenever you talk to like Marxist Leninists and how are they going to deal with opposition, they can only think in terms of repressive hard power. And I agree when it comes to certain aspects, like if you have a far-right militia trying to, terrorize people and they're trying to forcefully take over the government or mobilize, through violence. I mean, yeah, even in this society, you'll get shut down by the secret police if you do that. You'll get you're disobeying the law. I agree with hard power in those circumstances, but what really gets me is when you hear like radical leftists online talk about how they just want to guillotine all these right wingers, and all these right wingers will go to the gulag. And I think really like with that sort of thinking is just going to repeat Stalinism again. And it's bad, not just morally. That's the problem. I think a lot of lefties, they look at it, they disregard the liberal criticisms of Soviet regimes because they say that's moralistic thinking. Why do you have so much sympathy for the fascists? And it's not just that. It's that when you go overboard with cracking down on dissent, you actually make the problem worse, and you make it feel as though the only way for people to express their disagreement is through violence and is through revolting in a more serious way rather than just expressing their criticism. Because, for example, I believe in a socialist society, people like Jordan Peterson, they should be able to stay there and criticize. I don't care. He won't have probably as much money as he does, but he should be able to criticize. You should be able to have right-wing media. They shouldn't be funded by billionaires. They'll lose most of their resources and all the crazy privileges they have. And there's probably some ways in which one could, I guess, censor dissident elements that aim to overthrow the government, like any society that wants to govern does. But I think there needs to be a regime in which that tolerates opposition, even if it disagrees with it. You could sell it in a liberal way to say, oh, I believe in toleration. That's how probably Matt would say.
Yeah, totally.
But that doesn't sell well with a lot of leftists because they're like, why would I tolerate Jordan Peterson and all these people? I hate them.
Well, you know what? There's not that many leftists, so we can ignore them actually in reality. Like, no.
That's fair. That's fair. But I also think, though, if there's any change, a lot of those leftists are going to be in power, and fanaticism is involved in any radical change ever, regardless if it's one you support or not. It usually involves a degree of fanaticism. So I think that's unavoidable. We can't just say reject that. But what I would say is if we frame it in this Machiavellian position, I guess, which is you're tolerating opposition to a degree, because if you crack down on it too much, you'll exacerbate resistance, and also perhaps maybe they'll get it out of their system. Let them all go to Rumble. Let Andrew Tate, let all the right wingers, let them all make their
let them LARP.
Exactly,
Yeah,
let them do it. Who cares? And that's contained opposition. So I think if you make a sense of it that way, you can kind of understand the tactically useful way of for liberalism, really, for giving a certain degree of liberties even to the enemy, because sometimes I think this is where capitalist regimes go wrong. People on the far right tend to, I think, handle dissent much worse compared to people on the center, the liberals, because the far right, they overreact to every protest. They think Black Lives Matter. We need to send in the cops. We need to send in the stormtroopers. In reality, actually, what you should be doing is taking a knee for George Floyd, because that seems to do way more to like ossify the resistance.
Is this theory? Do you see yourself as you're saying even if you're a liberal, these are the best tactics anyway, but you're acting as a socialist tactician? Is that fair to say what you're describing here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think tactically in terms of that regard, the practical aspect of politics. I think it's always been an interest to me because I was literally taught back in my undergrad how to do propaganda for the existing system. And I don't support the existing system, but I do think realistically you need any system that's going to maintain itself is going to have propaganda, it's going to have administration. So how do you do this effectively? How do you take the lessons of the enemy and take them to your side? Because if we go the anarchist route, which is reject hierarchy, reject power, you can't separate means from ends. You just end up, being so allergic to power, you never touch it.
We should use it. Yeah.
We should use it. I have a question about this because we're here and there's a we here and there's a bunch of shadows or ghosts in the room with us. The online left is making an appearance, the anarchists and the tankies. And if this is going to take a form of something like strategy, don't you have to have some of the current mechanisms of power accounted for as something that you can even strategize about or change because I don't know, it's a little
Yeah, well,
bit,
he's not.
it's a little bit cart before the horse when we're speculating, but speculating tactically, I guess. But eschewing the current status quo and the world that we live in is going to amount to no result.
Oh well, do you mean like what kind of actual politics does he want, or because I mean I just hear him as saying that we need to learn from like the success of liberalism, that like the way that it has this that it allows for dissent. It's like we need to learn from that and like
But who's
build a
we?
system.
Who's we?
The left. I don't know, like
the
socialists,
left.
people who want
Socialists.
working class values. Yeah.
Bruh, you're skipping to V for Vendetta too. First, you either have to get elected or overthrow elections.
Well, but you see, that's where actually a argument I've heard from Marxists who try to use that as a sort of way to get out of thinking about this sort of thing. I'm not saying you're doing that because I don't think you're like an orthodox Marxist or anything like that, but
Definitely not.
that is
What do you mean? What if I were? All that it would take is for me to get on a different t-shirt. Meanwhile, if I'm looking at this from the outside, having this speculative tactical discussion is the same as having a tactical discussion in D&D.
yeah, post left. Okay, but
Yeah,
none of us-
you keep trying to sloganize it with names, but I'm wondering,
Okay,
we're going to rehash like a 300-year-old debate between leftism and liberalism. But
Sure,
there
I'll
is
give-
no we, because we're using special effects to create a situation that doesn't exist, then to argue about if the situation existed, then what's the most important
it's
things to
important
get right?
'cause you like, okay, should we not see what the system we want looks like? We should try to envision it, even if there is no politics there to meaningfully get there. I think it's worth thinking about it.
Pills is a doomer who doesn't think
Because-
anything's possible.
because-
Yes,
A lot
this is something you both say. You call me a doomer. One time at the end of his video is like, I'm not a nihilist, but I don't think I'm a nihilist either. I'm just asking, what are we even having the conversation about? What is the actual
Critical
reference?
pushback segment.
Well, if you want to talk about systems, I'm happy to. But it's also fair for me to ask what this one's made of. All systems consume energy. So is this one just made of cycles of conversation? Is it made of air?
Well, look, I want to be also sorry to interrupt here, but like I also feel like part of this is maybe my fault because I was pushing him to tell me like normatively what he wants, which isn't in the video, right? It's like, so I don't know, maybe like this could be partly my fault because like, I'm
Robert
just
Greene?
curious.
You know Robert
Yeah.
Greene, that popular
The boy, the
author?
like ocular democracy. Is that who you're to? No, yeah, that's
no,
Jeffrey
Robert
Greene. Never
Greene.
mind.
That's super like mainstream airport book type author, but he writes books like 48 Laws of Power,
No, I don't
33
think
strategy,
Oh
33
yeah.
Strategies of War, Laws of Human Nature. He's one of those guys who just writes sort of Machiavellian or realist analysis of the world and power, but for advice that anyone can use it, a politician, businessman, student, whatever. So I see this, what I'm doing in terms of political advice. I'm not doing politics because doing politics involves organizing a party and involves, reaching out to people and figuring out what your vision is. But I think the tactical discussions are something that lacks on the left, because let's say you try to do politics and you have a party, and let's say even you find yourself getting elected to power. Well, then what? What if you don't know what you're doing? Like it's important to think about that sort of thing, or else you just end up reacting in the moment. You end up winging it. And sometimes there's only limited degree of what we can do there. But if you don't think about what economic plan you want to implement, you're going to end up hiring status quo advisors who are going to just do the same old thing because you don't want to take a risk.
So are you
That's
are you the Machiavelli to AOC? Are you writing the prince for her?
Yeah, the Machiavelli's the socialist. That's what we have to write then.
Well, I would say even this entire so-called Machiavellian element is pretty subtle, implicit in the video, right? Which is, I'm only even talking about it because sort of Victor got it out of me, but I'm glad that he noticed that, because that is what I wanted the people. I have two audiences in mind. I have the audience who I want to be more critical of the system and not analyze it only on its own terms, right? So people who believe in liberal democracy on his own terms, they think, oh, you can protest and that's it. Like, why are you complaining? You can protest. Like that's how someone like Fukuyama thinks, for example.
That's good to know, and good to hear you reflect on audience too, because I'm not trying to do simply, that cheap criticism that's like, solve all the problems that I can imagine for me right now, now that you're here. I'm more interested in the media question, like what do conversations like this produce? What do books like this produce? Is it the sort of ongoing word game that we like to play? Because no problem, all of us enjoy these games.
We kind of worry on our podcast that we are part of the contained opposition, and
Yeah.
anything we say about, say, what's the road to socialism, here's the game plan, here's alternative visions, but that all presupposes that we have this space where the Gestapo's not knocking our door down. We can just make our podcasts, we can make our videos. We worry about that stuff because it's like, okay, but how do we really know, how do we really break out of this? If capitalism is this totalizing system that can co-opt or control its opposition, then all this seems like it's just really a symptom of that. We're never going to have a breakthrough. I think, like, even protesting is kind of useless, right? You say, I'm not saying all protesting is useless, but like kind of is, right? Even if it's successful, then the media just spins it as like, oh, look at these like sort of Hamas supporters, right? You can never really have a good, even if you have a good protest that's successful, just get spun in the media and everyone will hate you. It seems like we can never really break out of this. If we're really in this sort of hyper-real media simulated landscape, then it just seems like nihilism is the way to go, or it's where we're all going to end up.
Well, at the end of it, end of the video, what I said is that false hopes are just as crippling as nihilism, or something around something like that. But
yeah, too much optimism or something.
Yeah, and I think both fatalism and hope are two sides of the same coin, because they kind of presuppose a teleology or a finality, when in that sort of idea of the end of history, that there's nothing that can be changed, or that the idea that socialism is inevitable and that you just might hope for it. I think both of those are illusions. And this is where I would agree with someone like Alain Badiou's idea of the event, because sometimes there are catalyst events that can completely change the situation, but it's up to people at the end of the day to intervene into history, and take advantage of that event to promote a politics. Now, I don't really, as far as my estimation, as far as I'm aware of, I don't really see any politics in the United States or Canada at the moment on the left. I would say actually there are politics on the right. To some extent, you could say the trucker convoy was an event for the right, one that's saturated, but I think it was an event, not one which I would have criticisms of. But I think we should be willing to acknowledge when the opposition has its successes. But
you think it was an event in terms of there was a break, and that, like as you mentioned, Alain Badiou, you think this is an event that came from nothing and then actually shifted the direction that politics was headed?
I think it shifted it shifted the whole way we thought about the pandemic, because after the trucker protests, they all opened up, all the provinces. They all, eased their restrictions. People stopped caring about COVID. I think another event was the Russia-Ukraine war, but that's more of an obvious event. It kind of had something to do with that. But also the trucker convoy showed it kind of revitalized a very old means of protesting, which is more effective, which is, blockades. They effectively they blocked the stream of international trade with the United States. And that's why it was seen as an existential threat by the establishment, and why they literally seized people's bank accounts to stop it. Now, I'm critical of the people who participate in the truckers. I'm not a fan of some people who are leaders of the movement who are, like neo-Nazis and stuff. And I think a lot of them are just a bunch of idiots, to be frank. But to act like that wasn't a meaningful protest, that did far more to, scare the government into accepting many of their demands, in comparison to a lot of protests we've seen on the left these days, which end up amounting to chanting slogans and posturing. And I don't want to seem too disparaging here, like I said, but
do you really see a causal connection though between?
We've probably all been to protests here and have been burnt out and felt a little stupid. Like I think
Or
we probably all
strikes.
shared that experience.
Yeah, I was there to protest a real event when Vancouver lost the Stanley Cup to Boston.
But do you really see a causal link between the trucker protest and those policies? Like I thought they were coming up anyway. Like I don't know, maybe I need to go back and look, but I don't really recall it being like. I think their time was kind of up anyway. Like I don't know. It's hard for me to. Maybe there was a real impact there, but my memory was kind of like, oh well, we're gonna do this anyway, and then the truckers stopped.
In Canada, it definitely seemed like it immediately shifted the government's policies, especially the provincial governments. I mean, you saw immediately with like Ontario, Saskatchewan, and even Quebec. But
Could
like,
be.
yeah, it's. I think events don't come out of nowhere. I don't want to say that. Like there's always a material basis of events. They never just come out of nowhere. But
Well, that's
I mean,
kind of
it's-
Badiou's idea, is that events do.
Yeah.
They come from below the count. Not out of nowhere materially speaking, but out of nowhere where they cannot be imagined, and then suddenly everything has changed.
yes,
Then,
yeah,
then the trucker
I
protest.
think I just need a little bit more convincing that the trucker convoy was that type
Well-
of moment below the count.
Well,
And
if they were
the thing about
if the
events,
g-
right? They have to remember one of the things Badiou says is people have to have a fidelity to it in
Yeah,
order
the
for it to
fidelity.
actually have that impact. So if it's an event that happens and people forget about it, or there's the I don't want to go and explain Badiou with the obscure subject and the reactive subject and all that, but it's people's choice to actually see that as an event, because if people just go on about their lives later and forget about it, it loses its status as that. But temporarily, it might have a change in the logic of the world. But things can go back to usual. Now, there's a whole debate one can have. Now, this is probably something in Pill's wheelhouse as to whether events in the Badiouian sense are really possible in the virtual age. I think that's a scary thing to think about. I'd like to not think that events are not possible due to simulation, but maybe they're at least more rare. They're
seems
certainly
like
more rare.
they got the soft power treatment at the right wing protests get the soft power treatment, whereas like the leftist protests like solidarity with Palestine will get the hard treatment, right? And then the news was kind of
I wouldn't
they
say
let them
the
go, they let them go.
yeah, they
for
cracked
so
down on the
long.
convoy.
Yeah,
I don't know. Freezing someone's bank account is a pretty big deal.
I mean, they
I'm sure they
infringed
gave them
infringed on
back.
constitutional liberties. Like even the Canadian Supreme Court ruled like that.
They went too far.
They went too far on liberties. Like even according to the system, like the system's own priests are saying that it went too far in cracking down on the opposition. So
it just seemed how long they took to really even think about calling in the army and all the discussions, the quitting of the chief of police or whatever, all that stuff seemed like really dragging their feet. Whereas if there's like an indigenous protest, it's like send the RCMP.
that's true.
right
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
get
yeah.
them out of here, and then they get the hard treatment. And the news is like, oh well, we're not really comfortable with their sort of fascist ideology, but like these people have real grievances, we should listen to them. Whereas when it comes to the left, it's like these are a bunch of fucking radicals. Fuck them. Get the batons in there.
It
and beat the
depends
shit
on
out of them.
depends on the left, I guess. But like I didn't see that with Black Lives Matter. Like Black Lives Matter, for the most part, the protests, aside from the
Pretty positive
violence
coverage.
and stuff and the destruction of property, it was pretty positive coverage. Yeah, we can't really say the media is unequivocally. Depends what you mean by left. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly
yeah.
I think Palestine, there's a vested interest due to Israel lobby and all sort of stuff like that to be a bias against Palestine protests. But there's a lot of progressive causes in which the media is, pretty partial to in some regard. But I think we have to be careful what we mean by left and what we mean by politics. And those aren't easy things to delineate, certainly. But yeah, I agree with
Yeah,
you.
I was going to ask
Generally,
you
the
how
media
you'd
is-
find.
The media is more the state will be more repressive towards the left, but that's, I think, insofar as the left is hurting the interests of the ruling class, and in the case of the indigenous protests, it's because of oil pipelines. So they're going to respond with full force against that because they don't want oil pipelines being built. And I think they wouldn't have responded to the trucker convoy at all if they didn't block trade with on the border of the U.S. If they weren't hurting the interests of capital, in other words,
Mhm.
they wouldn't have been posed as a threat. They would just be peaceful protesters or whatever.
So thank you to
I
the
wanted to-
truckers. I mentioned before, there's really a net benefit of having a reactionary right that's just spun off into their own mirror universe, because the kind of despotic thing Trudeau would try to do is like create monthly listening to each other sessions, but they're so far they would all start smoking cigarettes just because he said we're not going to sell them anymore. So thank you for keeping our communist dictator in check. So we have time for probably one more segment. So yeah, I'll kick it to you, Victor.
Yeah. So I have a question. I'm wondering if you have a model of the human subject, and let me elaborate on, because, in your video, it seems like, this talk of contained opposition system, right? It's, as we've been talking about, it's sort of got that conspiratorial or like kind of like all encompassing feature to it, or texture to it. And so there's maybe an implicit, totalizing was the word I was looking for. Thank you, Eric. So there's maybe an implicit idea that, like, people aren't doing anything because they genuinely prefer it, right? So people in liberal democracies, even though they have their their freedoms, they still stick to the system because the system's so good at manipulating them into, buying into it.
Like a Marcusean critique, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that sort of implies, well, then what is the human subject? Just something like a sponge that just like accepts what it's given, or is it possible that people just prefer liberal democracy or something like that? And it sounds like in your video you do upfront say, hey, like, I'm not saying that totalitarianism is better, and like I'm not saying that. I'm just curious, like, where is the subject in all this? Is it just a reflection of power, or is there actual desires there?
Ooh,
Wait,
Vic
no.
busting out the one thing that the Pill Pod seems to have come to an agreement on, that the most reliable human drive is to resist doing anything differently.
But yes.
Well, I don't really have that full Marcusean critique that, people are just atomic. I don't even think that's really a fair characterization of Marcuse's critique, to be honest, of that people are
I
just
wasn't invoking Marcuse, but yeah.
Oh, well, it does remind me of the Frankfurt School critique that people are just manipulated. That's why they support the system, etc. But I mean, even in their critiques, they're saying that there's a material basis for it. Like Marcuse's whole thing in One Dimensional Man is that people support the system partially, more because they're just more well off. I mean, they have cushy jobs and stuff, but that's increasingly not the case. I mean, we have a proletariat that's replaced with the precariat. I mean, you just have a gigification of the economy. You have more instability. Even people who are in the so-called managerial class are getting proletarianized, like
housing crisis,
adjunct professors, as you know, like
yep.
Yeah, you just people. It's like, yeah. Don't get me started on that. But the theory of the subject. Okay, so I wouldn't say I have my own theory of the subject or nothing like that, but I dabble, and I'm not decided as to where I lean, but I do dabble between Badiou's theory of the subject, which is very complicated, and Zizek's Lacanian Hegelian theory of the subject, which are kind of always they're very in tension with each other, and it's something I'm still trying to think through. I wouldn't say I exactly fully can say like I have a theory of the subject, but I guess to answer your more practical aspect of the question, which do people have agency, and are they maybe obeying the system because it's in their
actually just
rational
like
interest? They actually just like it. I think that's true for a degree of the population. It's not true for a large degree of it, because you can just see that in polls. We have our prime minister in Canada's popularity is at an all-time low, and you have voting turnout as, I believe, something 64%, very, very low in Canada. And U.S. voter turnout is quite low. People often even vote for the Democrats solely to get Trump out, who they believe is worse. Yeah, no, you have also that famous, the Harvard study, where the correlation between what policies are popular and what policies get introduced in Congress, there was almost like a zero chance or something, 0.00 chance that people have an impact on it. So I think that people do want, a lot of people do want the system to be better, and there's, they have no means whatsoever, institutionally speaking, of changing that system in terms of alternatives. I go into this more in depth with Wolin's work and the managed democracy, inverted totalitarianism aspect. So there is a degree in which people are, I think, do obey the system because they like it, but I think it's not true for a large degree, and we can see that in polling data regarding policies that are popular but that don't get at all introduced by the government, and the dissatisfaction. Yeah, a lot of MLs like to point out the fact that supposedly China has greater popularity for its government than Canada or US, but that might be a better example actually of your case, that maybe people obey those sort of authoritarian systems when they simply do well, when they see their standard of living increase.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the problem, right? When your legitimacy is based on that, what happens when it decreases? In this system, because our legitimacy has nothing to do with standard of living or freedom or any of that. It has to do with well,
it must be tacked to it somehow, though, because I think, like you said at the beginning, if things get bad enough, like there seem to increasingly be, I think that's going to be a legitimacy threat no matter what regime you're in.
I think on these polls, when they say, "Are you happy with the system as it is?" and then 60% say no, then the follow-up question should be, "All right, are you willing to dedicate 5 hours per week to change it?" And I think you'd see.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, you drop that to, I don't know, less than 20%.
Oh, never mind. I'm happy.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Never mind. I have to do work. Never mind.
Yeah,
I kind of agree with that. It's kind of like the classic example when you ask like Americans, do you want social, free healthcare? It'll be like, and like AOC will be like, look, like 65% of Americans want. But then if you ask them, do you want healthcare, but it's going to mean your taxes are going to go up by like 3%, then it's like, it goes down to like 15%.
Do you want healthcare, but you're not allowed to have Netflix? Pick.
Yeah, you mentioned Zizek there too. It's in the video. And
yes.
He's got, in his theory of the subject, but his gaps aren't exactly the gaps in contained opposition. They're like gaps in the symbolic order.
Right. Yeah.
All these theories about recovering some lost purity or some authentic community, he calls it. And then there's like a fall.
Sure understands the logic, I think, of contained opposition. I mean, he describes it perfectly. It's just that for him, it's more at a psychoanalytic level. He doesn't really conceptualize it at the level of political structures.
Yeah, because inherent transgression is his way of replacing that sort of perfect community. Then there's a fall and we've lost something. And now we're in this phase where we're going to get it back now at some point. So there's a kind of almost like nostalgia for this time before the fall, this prelapsarian. And it creeps into all of our theories. And he wants to replace that with this idea of inherent transgression, which is the idea that, the emergence and the loss coincide, he says. It's actually like, they come about at the same time.
And that's sort of that analogy I made in the video when I talked about East Germany, how when they tried to suppress opposition to such an extreme extent, you have a return of the repressed, but in the real, as opposed to in the unconscious. And you have, and that comes in the fall. What I mean politically is you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was quite sudden. People did not predict that at the time. That's we always forget. Retroactively, we think it was such an inevitable thing, but at the time they thought you had even leftists like libertarian leftists like Cornelius Castoriadis who thought the Soviet type regimes were going to outlive the American regimes. And when I was reading them, I thought, how did these guys get it so wrong? How did they have such a wrong idea of power? And so I built off really just a lot of influences I went off of, like Zizek's one of them, but someone like Byung-Chul Han, I think, also understands power very well in his book, What is Power? And Psychopolitics. But this idea of power not being this in a Hobbesian view and a physicality, but rather being an expression of not having to do as little as possible in order for people to obey our will.
Yeah, it's a big monolithic theory of power centralized on the Leviathan embodied in the monarch or in the person who holds that power. Right.
Well, I like that as a place to stop. Victor, I know you had a bunch of questions. Were you able to get through them, or you want to recap something?
I mean, actually, it's funny because when Tony started answering, I think one of my first questions, I don't know why, but I was expecting us to maybe disagree more, like just based on your video. But then like when you started unpacking what you meant, I was like, okay, well, some of these other questions were sort of premised on the fact that maybe we would have disagreements. I was just quickly going to mention that, what you were talking about there, how did they get this so wrong? It reminds me, you mentioned Hart and Negri earlier, and like in Empire, and I think even in Multitude, they talk about how they're so optimistic about the internet. They're like, the internet's going to be this new, opportunity for free expression where, these networked struggles will work together. And it's just so funny how wrong they were about that. Maybe it's because of a misunderstanding of how power works. I wonder. I don't know. That could be an interesting paper right there to make that argument. But I don't know. I don't know if I really have a recap other than like I think we've covered a lot of ground. So
that's a chapter.
Oh, is it a chapter in your thesis?
Tyranny through decentralization.
Oh yeah, nice, good.
It seems to me like we're always at all times sitting in some network that can be called the system, but getting it wrong, it's a matter of like in the moment that it's operating, taking yourself outside of it, looking down at it as if it's an object and going, oh, I bet this is really what it's not going to be able to handle. This is the one thing that it's going to push it to its limit. And we keep getting to those limits. And by the time that happens, it's reorganized to adapt.
Exactly. Which is why I think I agree with a lot of the spirit, and especially the way you've unpacked it to like here. I mean, I think even though Pills is probably more of a, I don't know if like pessimist or like it's just like what's the point of talking about I don't know if you exactly said what's the point of talking about strategy, but I think what's good about this view is like it's not like the solution isn't just getting rid of the system, but it's like
there is a point to talking about strategy, and that's that it's fun. It's fun in the same way as playing D&D and writing chess guides is fun. This is something that we need because we need to feel like we're involved.
We need to have fun.
That's inherent transgression again.
Yeah, well, isn't all politics enjoyment to some extent? Even Zizek would say that, enjoyment, if you look at enjoyment as a political factor, right? It changes the way you view about politics. And in many ways, I had this great conversation with one of my favorite people at Theory Underground, Michael Downs. He has a blog called The Dangerous Maybe. I think a really great theory blog you'd find very interesting. I've actually always wanted to get you guys to talk to him at some point. But Michael Downs, I had this conversation with him because he's a total autodidact guy. Anyway, I asked him, how do you read so much? How do you read this much while working at Amazon and driving trucks? And he said, well, I'm not even that smart. This is where my jouissance is geared towards, where my enjoyment is, my death drive of wasting time reading theory happens to serve an intellectual direction. And I view it that way too. Like this very conversation is enjoyment, studying. Why should I study theory when I could be studying business books, how to get rich? That's more rational, right? But I kind of just get off, learning about politics. I guess it just happens to be, and maybe if more people, thought deeply about politics, maybe you'd have better politics. I don't know, but it's enjoyment. But I'll say that other worse ways of enjoyment is what I mean.
I'm glad you say that, because with the jouissance or with the pleasure principle, there's always this like flip into pain, or a potential flip into pain, and actually getting pleasure from the pain. And with a lot of the people who are obsessed with politics, I think they're not enjoying it anymore. The performance is a product of pain that is the only thing that they can get pleasure from at that point.
I mean, you know that all too well, making videos, don't you? I mean, why would you make the videos that you make? Why would you? I talked to you once, and you said that you do all your RGBs in your videos, your red, green, blue effects manually instead of using the preset. And I was like, you're crazy. That takes so much more time. And like just seeing, I saw on your stream how the way you edit, you take like the longest route. You do like everything from scratch. And it's like, why do you do that? That's death
video.
Drive. It's death drive, but it pays off, in terms of good art. But it's, it's death drive.
Nah.
I know it too well.
That's pleasure principle, because the death drive would be to hand my creative work which is myself for intents and purposes as far as the other is concerned. But the death drive would be to hand myself over to the presets and just use them. And it's not true that I don't use any presets. Although, if that's, I don't know, if editing is death drive, it would be something for me more akin to meditation, where the author dies and becomes the text, you know, Zen.
Flow state.
That's more my thing.
Is that different than it being jouissance? No.
I mean, if you take jouissance seriously, it's all jouissance.
Yeah, of
But-
course. Exactly.
Well, maybe here's where the jouissance comes in, is that I like thinking that if someone like One Dime were to pause on a frame of my video, they'd say, I see what you're doing here. Clever. Good boy.
And who understands what it takes to actually make it, right? Most people don't. So
Yeah, there's probably like 4 out of 1,000 that even know what After Effects is. Anyway, why don't we cut it there? We are going long, but thank you so much, One Dime. You've referenced a ton of videos that people can go look at. Well, we were talking about controlled opposition, a theory, and the theory is actually contained opposition. And yeah, we got books to check out that you're referencing, and anywhere
coming out
else,
with a
Check
book.
out the video.
anywhere else
blogs.
that people should go. What's your favorite video that people have not watched? Maybe.
Enough,
Control
yeah.
opposition video, because
Okay, there you go.
the control opposition video underperformed compared to my other videos. Everyone wants to have me on to have the talk about the Cultural Revolution stuff. Kind of sick talking about it. But
Right.
the control opposition one, I'm very, very proud of, especially in that.
Well,
I think that
hopefully,
doesn't get enough
this
love.
gives it a boost.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
And your book is going to be called Liberal Totalitarianism: The Spectrum of Capitalist Democracy and What Makes the U.S. Different, coming out later this year too, just so you don't have to call that out for yourself.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I have a podcast also. So if you don't like watching videos and you just want to listen to stuff on the way to work, I have One Dime Radio, the podcast where I talk about mainly theory, history, politics, and economics, but lately a lot of theory and history mainly. And yeah, and if you want to give me money on Patreon, go for it. If you got the bucks to spare.
Is that podcast
Ooh.
just you, or do you have guests on, or do you have some co-hosts, or
Yeah,
what's
you
I've
the-
just
on.
interviewed Andrew Feenberg. He's Marcuse student and expert on Marcuse and technology, things like that,
Cool.
and Canadian academic.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks
Yeah,
for
this was
coming
a lot of
by. For everyone out there, I hope you got off. That's what I'll say. This is what it is.
Yeah, good
As long as
message.
there's some jouissance going, we're transgressing together. We're getting off.
They don't want you to hear this. All right. Take care, guys.
Sure.